Have you ever felt like you were lost in a maze of different philosophical ideas and you just wished there was a simple way to get to the heart of it all? Well, today we're going to try to do exactly that. We're taking a deep dive into the thinking of a truly unique philosopher.
Yeah, and what's especially fascinating about this particular thinker is that his philosophical ideas were really closely connected to the way he actually lived his life.
Exactly. So we're diving into the world of Henry David Thoreau today, and our guide for this journey is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on him. It's an incredibly thorough resource, so think of it as your shortcut to understanding the essence of his philosophy.
And if we kind of zoom out a bit, this resource really gives us this well-researched and nuanced perspective on Thoreau's work. I mean, it would take ages to try to piece together all of his ideas from different sources, so this is really helpful.
Absolutely. Our goal for you, the listener, is to pull out the most insightful and important parts of Thoreau's philosophy, especially those that relate to living a more thoughtful life and interacting with the world in a meaningful way. And we're going to do it all without getting bogged down in complicated academic language. We're looking for those aha moments, those surprising insights that really stick with you. So let's jump right in. Thoreau, born and died in Concord, Massachusetts, 1870 to 1862. It's like his whole intellectual life was connected to this one specific place, which is kind of a fascinating parallel to someone like Kierkegaard.
Right, you've hit on something important there. It wasn't just a coincidence that Thoreau was so connected to his environment. It really shaped his whole perspective on philosophy. Being rooted in that specific place allowed him to observe the natural world and human experience in such detail that he was able to gain these deep insights about nature and the self that actually resonate with people everywhere.
That's really interesting. And then there's his relationship with Emerson. The encyclopedia uses the word turbulent to describe their friendship. Philosophical differences, personal complexities, but still, it clearly had a big impact on both of them. It's a reminder that even the most brilliant minds have complicated relationships, and sometimes those intellectual clashes can actually be really productive for shaping ideas.
It makes you think that intellectual growth can actually be fueled by disagreement and debate. I mean, even though there was tension between Emerson and Thoreau, their exchanges probably pushed them to refine their arguments and articulate their own unique philosophical positions.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the journal. This massive multi-volume work that he kept up for years. It seems like almost everything he published came from these personal reflections, and he was constantly revising and adding to them. The encyclopedia even suggests that the journal itself could be considered a major philosophical work. That says a lot about his dedication to self-examination.
It really does. It shows us how important Thoreau thought self-reflection was to the whole philosophical process. The journal gives us a unique look into how his thinking evolved over time, like a constant process of observing, questioning, and refining his understanding of the world and his own place in it.
Right. And then we come to Walden, which is probably the work that most people think of when they hear Thoreau's name. 2 years and 2 months spent at Walden Pond. But it wasn't just a retreat into nature, right? The encyclopedia describes it as this intensive time of examination, a philosophical venture in the true sense of the ancient Greeks seeking wisdom through direct experience. It makes you wonder if maybe we could all benefit from those kinds of focused periods of reflection in our own lives.
Totally. Thoreau's experiment at Walden wasn't him running away from philosophy. It was actually him living it out, embodying it. He wanted to understand what it really means to be human by simplifying his life and immersing himself in nature. That connects directly with what listeners are often looking for, knowledge they can apply to their own lives.
Yeah, I see that. And Walden itself is such a unique piece of writing. It's hard to put it into a single category, part narrative, part poetry, part philosophy, part observations of nature. And the fact that it has such a huge and enduring global readership suggests that it tapped into something really fundamental about what it means to be human.
If we look at it from a broader perspective, the fact that Walden has remained so popular for so long points to a universal longing for meaning and authenticity, for a connection with nature. It's hard to categorize, just like Thoreau himself was hard to categorize as a philosopher. He didn't fit neatly into any box.
I like that. Okay, here's where things get really interesting. The philosopher Stanley Cavell has this kind of provocative view of Thoreau. He suggests that Thoreau can be seen as an embarrassment to traditional philosophy because his style of thinking doesn't fit into the typical academic mold. But Cavell also points out that, like Descartes, Thoreau starts by talking about why he's personally driven to ask these big questions. It's about rooting philosophical inquiry in your own intellectual and existential anxieties. So if some philosophers disagree with that view, What might be at the heart of their disagreement with Cavell's assessment of Thoreau's approach?
That's a great question. Philosophers who stick to the more conventional ways of doing philosophy might think that Thoreau's focus on personal experience and his literary style means that he's not being systematic or objective enough in his arguments. But what Cavell is saying is that Thoreau's commitment to really getting at the truth of things, grounded in his own lived experience, is a different but equally valid way of doing philosophy. It starts with the individual and how they relate to the world.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about nature. Emerson saw nature as mostly symbolic, like a representation of deeper spiritual truths. But Thoreau saw the physical world itself as the realm of spirit, full of direct, sacred meaning. He wanted to find God in nature and hear nature's language without metaphor. That's a pretty big difference in perspective, wouldn't you say? If someone was used to Emerson's symbolic view, how might Thoreau challenge them to think differently?
That's a good point. Thoreau would probably argue that focusing on nature as a symbol misses the point. It overlooks the fact that the physical world itself is sacred and valuable in its own right. He wouldn't see a tree just as a symbol of some spiritual idea. He'd see the tree itself with all its complexities and its place in the ecosystem as having intrinsic spiritual significance. He wanted a direct experience of nature's meaning, not one that had to be interpreted through symbols. He wanted to understand the essence of nature, what it truly is, not just what it might stand for.
Right. And Thoreau was really advocating for nature's intrinsic worth, which sets him apart from a lot of other transcendentalists who tended to see nature mostly in relation to humans or the spiritual realm. He's saying that nature has values simply because it exists, not because it's useful to us.
And that's a really important idea, especially now when we're talking about environmental ethics. Thoreau's perspective gives us a strong philosophical foundation for arguments that support protecting nature based on its inherent dignity, regardless of whether it's useful to humans.
Absolutely. And then there's this idea of the value of a fact. Thoreau didn't see a strict separation between objective facts and subjective values. For him, the concrete details of the natural world held profound and meaningful truths. Beauty and order weren't just things that humans project onto nature. They came from within it.
That's interesting. It implies that Thoreau had this holistic view of knowledge. He thought that observing the natural world carefully and in detail could reveal inherent values and meanings, blurring the lines between science and philosophy. He saw perception as an active, embodied process that uncovers the meaning already present in the world.
I see what you mean. And he even talks about the living earth having a life of its own that goes beyond the plants and animals we usually think of. He mentions this slumbering subterranean fire, which is such a powerful image of the planet as this dynamic living thing.
Yeah, it's a really evocative image, and it aligns with a lot of modern ecological thinking that emphasizes the interconnectedness and dynamism of the Earth's systems. Thoreau's idea of a living Earth suggests that he had an awareness of the planet as this complex, self-regulating entity long before modern science fully developed those concepts.
It's amazing how ahead of his time he was in some ways. And for Thoreau, nature had this grander significance when you look at it on its own terms, separate from how it might be useful to humans. He makes a distinction between beautiful and useful, and it's clear that he values beauty much more highly.
That's a really important distinction. It highlights Thoreau's ethical framework. He prioritized the aesthetic and spiritual aspects of nature over any practical uses it might have. He thought that engaging with nature on its own terms, appreciating its beauty, leads to a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it.
I like that. And then there's his idea of a pluralistic universe within nature, the idea that there are multiple valid points of view. For example, he says that squirrels are planters of forests from their perspective, and rain, even though we might find it inconvenient sometimes, is necessary for the whole ecosystem. It's about expanding our awareness beyond our own limited, human-centered perspective.
That shows how deeply Thoreau understood the interconnectedness of natural systems. He recognized that different organisms and processes play different roles, and what seems negative from one perspective can actually be vital from another. It encourages a more nuanced and less human-centric way of looking at the natural world.
It does. He draws this fascinating connection between wildness in nature and human potential, using the analogy of the seed ripening. He sees wildness as the source of creative energy in us, important not just in nature, but also in human endeavors like art. That's a pretty thought-provoking idea.
It is. It suggests that Thoreau saw the untamed parts of nature as a model for human growth and creativity. He thought that embracing our own wildness, that raw potential that hasn't been completely cultivated or conformed, is essential for individuals to thrive and for art to flourish.
That's a cool way to look at it. But Thoreau's view of nature wasn't all romantic and idyllic. In the Katahdin chapter of The Maine Woods, he portrays nature as primeval, untamed, and forever untamable. It's powerful, almost godlike, but not always gentle. It's a much more complex and realistic portrayal than just a peaceful haven.
Right. He acknowledged the raw power and indifference of nature. It can inspire awe, but it can also be frightening. It reminds us that nature isn't just a peaceful retreat for humans. It has its own independent and sometimes formidable character.
It definitely does. Okay, let's move on to the ethics of perception. For Thoreau, awareness was a central virtue, being forever on the alert. Why do you think he put so much emphasis on that quality?
I think Thoreau believed that our ability to really perceive the world around us with all our senses and with an open mind is absolutely fundamental to living a meaningful and ethical life. Being forever on the alert lets us fully experience the richness and complexity of the world, recognize its value, and understand where we fit in. It's about actively engaging with reality instead of just passively moving through it.
That makes sense. He talks about painting the very atmosphere that we perceive through, suggesting that cultivating our awareness shapes not only what we see, but the entire way we experience reality. And he's often called a philosopher of the senses, highlighting this embodied aspect of his perception, how our sensory experiences connect us to our surroundings.
It emphasizes Thoreau's belief that knowledge isn't just something intellectual or abstract. It's grounded in our physical interaction with the world. Our senses aren't just passive receivers of information, they're active tools that shape our understanding and connect us to the reality around us.
Right. And for Thoreau, perception becomes a moral test. He says the perception of beauty is a moral test. He laments all the beauty that we miss in our everyday lives. He wants us to refine our senses, to become more receptive. He famously wrote, "A man has not seen a thing who has not felt it." What's the connection he's drawing between perceiving beauty and morality?
He's saying that our ability to see and appreciate beauty is connected to our moral sensitivity. If we're tuned into the beauty of the world, it means we have a certain level of openness, empathy, and attentiveness, and those qualities are also essential for ethical behavior. On the other hand, if we fail to see beauty, it might mean that our overall sensitivity is dulled and we're less capable of moral awareness.
Interesting. He also believed that while perception has a subjective element, the world, in a sense, is centered around each individual perceiver. This isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean we're trapped inside ourselves. Instead, our unique perspective acts as a lens through which we access the external world. He famously said, "No such thing as pure objective observation. Your observation, to be interesting, must be subjective." He seems to be suggesting that what we notice is deeply connected to what we care about.
Exactly. Thoreau recognized that our individual concerns, interests, and experiences inevitably shape what we perceive as significant. This subjectivity isn't a flaw. It's an inherent part of how we understand the world. Our unique perspectives allow us to see things that others might miss, contributing to a richer and more diverse understanding of reality.
It's like we each have a piece of the puzzle, and then there's his kind of critical view of science. He was worried that a purely scientific approach might rob the imagination and miss the humanity that's inherent in knowledge. He saw it as reducing knowledge to a dead language, unlike the poet's more imaginative and feeling-based perspective. Why do you think he felt that way?
I think Thoreau was concerned that an overly scientific approach, one that focuses too much on data and objective analysis, could make us less appreciative of the qualitative, emotional, and imaginative parts of our experience. He valued the poet's ability to evoke wonder and meaning, and he thought that a purely scientific lens might miss the deeper significance of the world for humans.
It's about not losing sight of the human element in the pursuit of knowledge. And he even goes so far as to suggest that the highest form of knowledge might involve recognizing the insufficiency of all that we called knowledge before. It's like a sudden realization, an embrace of mystery and the unfathomable. That's a radical concept for someone who's seeking knowledge.
Absolutely. It highlights Thoreau's belief that there are limits to human understanding, and real wisdom might involve acknowledging how much we don't know. He valued a sense of wonder and the recognition that some things might always remain beyond our grasp.
There's a certain humility in that. And finally, on the topic of perception, he proposes this idea that truth is perspective dependent. which leads to multiple valid understandings of reality, not just relativism. He values the unique insights that each individual perspective brings, and he calls this perspectival realism. So it's not that anything goes, but that different viewpoints offer different pieces of the truth.
You got it. Thoreau thought that truth has many sides, and different people, seeing the one from their unique positions, can offer valuable and different insights. This perspective encourages us to be tolerant of different viewpoints and to appreciate the richness of human experience.
I like that. Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about friendship, politics, and environmentalism in Thoreau's thought. He had this strong ethic of personal flourishing, emphasizing how important it is to align our daily lives with our deepest ideals. He talks about our enthusiasm for what really matters becoming temperament, an ingrained part of who we are. He speaks of the wisely conscious life coming from an unconscious suggestion, and he describes character as settled genius. It's all about living with intentionality.
It really underscores how important it was for Thoreau to integrate his values into every aspect of his life. He thought that a truly fulfilling life is one where our actions match our deepest beliefs, where our ideals aren't just abstract concepts but actually guide how we live.
Makes sense. He also had a really high standard for friendship. He valued people who praised our aspirations, not just our accomplishments. He called it an exalted ideal, although he seemed to have doubts about whether it could be fully realized in practice. Still, it makes you think about what we truly value in our closest relationships.
You're right. Thoreau's view of friendship challenges us to think about how our relationships contribute to our personal growth and support us in pursuing our highest ideals. He valued friends who saw our potential, not just our successes.
It's a good reminder. Now, it's fascinating how connected his understanding of wild nature is to his ideas about society and politics. He uses nature as a kind of moral compass, a source of wisdom and ethics that exists outside of the influences of society, which he often saw as corrupting.
That's a key part of what made Thoreau so radical. He looked to the inherent order and value in nature as a way to critique the injustices and problems in human society. Nature provided a standard for him to measure the artificiality and moral compromises of civilization against.
I see that. His decision to go live at Walden Pond can be seen as an attempt to distance himself from those societal values and political structures. He develops this concept of they, this sort of unthinking mass of people who just blindly follow conventions. It kind of anticipates critiques like Heidegger's Das Man. And Thoreau saw this they as a corrupting force, leading to people becoming complacent with injustice, like he saw with the issue of slavery.
And what's really insightful is how early Thoreau recognized the dangers of conformity and how social pressure can obscure the truth about what's right and wrong. His critique of they highlights how important independent thinking is and the need to resist just accepting the norms without questioning them.
Definitely. And that conviction led him to become an activist. He was involved in the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad, and he was a vocal supporter of John Brown. He clearly believed that it was necessary to resist injustice, even advocating for nonviolent revolt when needed.
Thoreau's strong ethical principles drove him to put his beliefs into action. He thought that if you believe something is morally wrong, you have a responsibility to actively resist it.
And that brings us to his famous idea of civil disobedience, the justification for disobeying laws that are unjust. He famously said, social consensus is not a guarantee of rectitude or truth, meaning that just because most people agree on something doesn't make it right. He believed that individual conscience has more authority than the state. There are simply more sacred laws to obey than the laws of society. That's a powerful statement about individual responsibility.
Looking at it from a broader perspective, Thoreau's defense of civil disobedience has been incredibly influential on movements for social and political change all over the world. It underscores the fundamental importance of individual conscience in challenging unjust authority and working towards a more just society.
It's amazing how far-reaching his ideas have been. Okay, let's wrap up by considering where Thoreau fits within the larger world of philosophy. He's often labeled as a transcendentalist, but the encyclopedia points out that this label doesn't fully capture the nuances of his thought. It mentions some pretty significant differences between him and other figures in the movement, like Emerson, especially in their views on Christianity and the importance of sensory experience.
That's a good reminder that intellectual history is complex and it's hard to put people into neat categories. While Thoreau shared some common ground with transcendentalism, his unique combination of ideas and his focus on certain themes set him apart.
It's like he was forging his own path. And his intellectual influences were incredibly diverse. They ranged from classical Greek and Roman philosophy to Asian traditions, modern European philosophy, from Descartes to the German idealists, and even the emerging field of natural science. He was inspired by people like Humboldt and Darwin.
What's really remarkable is how broadly and deeply Thoreau engaged with different intellectual traditions. He wasn't limited to just one school of thought. He drew from all these different sources to create his own unique perspective.
He was a true synthesizer of ideas. And it's amazing to learn that he anticipated many later developments in philosophy, foreshadowing ideas that would become central to pragmatism, phenomenology, and environmental philosophy.
It speaks to how relevant and forward-thinking his ideas were. His insights into things like the connection between experience and knowledge, the nature of consciousness, and the importance of the environment really laid the groundwork for philosophical movements that came after him.
It's like he was planting seeds for the future of philosophical thought. And the encyclopedia notes that while his political ideas have gotten a lot of attention, thanks to their influence on people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., his contributions to philosophy are actually much broader than that. And there's a growing body of scholarly work on Thoreau today, which suggests that he's gradually gaining more recognition within the field of American philosophy.
And if we connect that back to the bigger picture, while Thoreau's essays on civil disobedience are still very influential, academics are starting to recognize and appreciate the full depth and breadth of his philosophical contributions, especially in areas like epistemology, ethics, and environmental philosophy.
It sounds like he's finally getting the recognition he deserves.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, let's distill a few key takeaways from our deep dive into the mind of Henry David Thoreau. First, the crucial importance of developing mindful awareness in how we experience and ultimately understand the world around us. Second, the profound recognition that the natural world has inherent value, regardless of whether it's useful to humans. And finally, the enduring power and ethical necessity of individual conscience in guiding our actions and shaping our relationship with society.
That raises a really important question for you to think about. How might consciously incorporating Thoreau's emphasis on mindful awareness into your everyday life lead to a richer and more meaningful experience of the world?
Thoreau challenges us to really see the world and to think critically about where we fit in. What aspects of your own life might look different if you viewed them through a more wild and aware perspective? We encourage you to explore Thoreau's writings for yourself, maybe starting with Walden or checking out the resources offered by the Thoreau Society. This deep dive is just the beginning of a much deeper engagement with these important philosophical ideas. Thanks for joining us.